Hello and welcome. This is Carolyn Woods at InEight. Today our talk is 6 ways to improve the benchmarking of your project plan. And I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Dan Patterson, our Chief Design Officer here at InEight. Dan has a long history in software. He was part of Perkmaster and Acumen, and then came actually to InEight as part of an acquisition in 2018. Dan is a certified PMP for those PMPs on the phone as well, and he has his bachelor's degree in civil engineering and in construction management. We're also joined today by Paul Self, our Executive Vice President of Planning and Delivery, and I'd like to turn the floor over to both of you.
All right, well, thank you very much, Carolyn. And on behalf of Paul and myself, thank you all very much for attending today's webinar. So, Paul, a very interesting, exciting topic around benchmarking, and specifically benchmarking project forecasts, whether those forecasts are schedule or cost, or indeed cost and schedule combined. I think to help set the scene before we start, Paul, would you say, typically when people think of benchmarking, they think of taking something that's already built and critiquing it and seeing how it compares and aligns?
I do. So it's typically looking at something that's already happened or been done. It's like looking in a rearview mirror, right, for your project. So that's what we've seen historically, at least.
Okay, so it's interesting. You mentioned rear view mirror. So I'd like to introduce a concept of benchmarking that is perhaps a little bit more forward thinking in terms of, wouldn't it be useful when putting a plan together, and today we're really going to focus on the topic of putting CPM schedules together, but when putting those schedules together, being able to leverage benchmarking so that as we're putting that forecast around time in place, being able to benchmark in real time as we're building the plan. So instead of using benchmarking as a historical look back, let's actually start to use benchmarking as a proactive means of ensuring that the plan and the forecast that we're putting together is more accurate. Make sense?
It does. It makes perfect sense. So rather than having just a static benchmark or reporting, we can actively interact with the benchmark and use it to help drive the quality of our plan.
Exactly. So instead of just saying, okay, well, we're going to compare against how we previously performed and report on it, reporting is actually in my mind, a complete and utter waste of time unless you do something with the reporting. So let's use that reporting in the form of benchmark analysis and proactively recalibrate and realign our plans based on whether or not the benchmarking is showing a good thing or a bad thing.
Well, that's excellent. Where do we start this process?
So in terms of starting the process, in order to benchmark, this is going to sound a bit funny, but in order to benchmark, you have to have benchmark data. And I'm going to touch on some of the historical challenges that we've had over the years with regards to gathering historical schedule data. It's very unusual to have a high degree of commonality with regards to things like WBS structures in a series of schedules. In recent years, we've overcome that, and I'll explain how we've done that in a few minutes. But yeah, we're going to start with establishing that benchmark data. I'd also like to touch on the topic of productivity rates as well. So not just taking historical schedules and using them as benchmarks, but actually benchmarking against the rate at which we can execute work. One of the big challenges tied to capturing benchmark data has been that of data normalization and cleansing. So, those three initial bullet points on the slide here really all pertain to, well, let's establish our benchmark data. And then once we've got that in place, the actual benchmark analysis is actually very, very straightforward. What I would like to do again, though, is touch on benchmarking beyond just that of duration. Yes, we're going to talk about cost benchmarking and estimating benchmarking. But again, I think this is really pushing the boundaries here. We're going to talk about benchmarking things like sequence of work. So have we got the correct sequence in place as well as the correct durations and costs? And then I think what would be an interesting sidebar, Paul, is to get a bit of insight from you on your experience of rectifying slipped schedules through benchmarking. Sure. And then let's talk a little bit about AI and artificial intelligence and how we're using that in the basis solution to improve the benchmarking analysis. So when we think about benchmarking, I think it boils down to a simple comparison. We are comparing, in our world, the thing that we're building, which is the plan, against something else. And I believe that there are really three dimensions against which we can do that comparison. I think, first of all, there is massive value in comparing the plan that we're putting together against our historical performance, because that's a very, very strong indicator as to, okay, well, if historically it's taken us this long and this much money to execute, there's a very, very high probability that going forward, we're going to be very close to that historical performance. Secondly, industry norms. And I know that some of you out there are probably benchmarking or bringing in third-party benchmark organizations, pools such as IPA and CII, comparing your project to industry standards, industry norms. I think it's useful. I think there is more value, though, in comparing against your own historical performance. It's interesting to know how we compare to other organizations, but at the end of the day, I think the most telling benchmark that we can analyze is, well, let's look at how we compare to how we previously executed.
So there's multiple cuts and ways that we can look at and leverage the benchmark during the planning process.
Exactly, even to the point where, and again, this may sound a little odd, but benchmarking against yourself. So as you're building out your plan, doing I call it a self-benchmark. In some ways, it's similar to sort of snapping a baseline. And then over time, as the plan evolves, either because of scope development or maybe you actually get all the way through to execution, being able to compare and benchmark your current state versus a previous state in the project lifecycle, I think is very, very valuable.
Sure, absolutely.
So benchmarking is not a new science by any means. It's been around for, I would say, as long as planning and scheduling itself. But there's been this inherent challenge around differences in the structure of historical data. So again, having different WBS structures, different coding structures, it's very unusual for projects within an organization to follow a common enough hierarchical structure to make the comparison of apples with apples an easy and consistent process. Now, advances in artificial intelligence have massively overcome that issue, because now we can draw analogies and comparisons without having to have those exact matches within those structures.
Yeah, so we can let the machine do a lot of that heavy lifting for us.
Yeah, and the heavy lifting is less around coming up with the historical number in the benchmark. It's more around can the AI engine and the computer, can it come up with sensible analogous scope against which to do that comparison? Okay. So the approach we're taking with regards to benchmarking, and this is very, very embedded within the basis software, is that of a knowledge-based system. And the way it works is very, very straightforward. The knowledge library, the knowledge-based system, contains that historical information, those CPM schedules, those productivity rates, so on and so forth. But we don't need to have commonality of data structure within that. And the reason for that is the inference engine, that's kind of the heart of the artificial intelligence engine, again, is able to sift through differences between things like terminology and different descriptions, different types of definition for scope. It's able to say, okay, well, in project A, design is analogous to engineering in project B, and because of that analogy, to be able to then intelligently come back with a suggestion for the benchmark. So there's many different uses for artificial intelligence, and we're seeing a lot of those crop up in project planning as a whole. But specifically around benchmarking, the true value is being able to mine that historical information without the need for a high degree of commonality in the definition of the data.
Okay, and do you need a large volume of data in order to effectively benchmark your projects?
Great question. So a lot of talk and discussion around what is commonly known today as big data. So there is one school of thought that says, okay, if we can capture thousands and thousands of historical projects and as-built schedules, then we should be more confident about the reliability of looking at things like trends and benchmarks from that.
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to be very careful there because, is there as much value in comparing me to the rest of the world population, or is it more valuable to compare me to others that are within a similar environment, a similar context? I would suggest it's the latter, and the same applies to projects. I think if I'm a project, I'm a CapEx project being executed in North America, and I'm a linear type project, then compare me to analogous North American linear projects. Don't take into account other geographical projects that are, vertical build or offshore projects, things like that. So I think as long as context can be drawn from very large amounts of data, I think there's value. I think in the shorter term, there is equal value in actually just starting off with a small data set. And that small data set can be as little as maybe half a dozen historical projects that our organization has worked on.
Sure. And indicative of the types of projects that you plan to execute in the future.
Exactly, so that you can have something meaningful and as you say, indicative to compare against.
Great.
So again, going back to building up your benchmark knowledge library, most people I think would simply think about duration and cost. And yes, that's very, very valuable. But I think there's even more we can glean from those historical as-built schedules. And one of the most valuable aspects of a historical schedule is not just how long and how much money did the project take, but what was the sequence and the order of work that was actually carried out. Very often, as you know, Paul, a project plan will show activity A driving B driving C, and in reality, when it comes to field execution, because of perhaps changes in scope or delays to delivery of equipment, site access constraints, things like that, that sequence of A, B, C may actually get executed as A to C to B, for example. So knowing the most common historical sequence of work and being able to benchmark the plan that you're putting together is incredibly valuable. And this is opening up a whole new level of smartness or intelligence around project planning. Because yes, it's one thing to get the duration and the cost right, but if the sequence is wrong, then your plan is utterly useless. So it's a really exciting area that is evolving and being able to benchmark against, again, the sequence of work is so valuable. And then I think tied to that, scope of work. So scope of work, being able to say, okay, well, this is the scope that I've defined in my project, and then being able to benchmark that against my my benchmark data to make sure that I haven't. It's really about omissions, Paul, rather than inclusions. Again, I think it's as important to know the stuff I've missed in a plan as it is to critique and benchmark the stuff that I've included.
Of course. So and defining that scope of work, can you tell me a little bit about the concept of deliverables and how that helps drive a better scope definition?
You bet. So as many of you know, in a scheduling tool, a CPM tool, the focus when building out your plan is you focus on activities and durations and logic links. So you define an activity, you tell the computer how long it's going to take, you sequence it with other activities, and the computer calculates the dates. That's CPM. What CPM tools haven't done up until recently is really properly differentiated between the work and the scope. And so our approach is a little different in that we're saying, okay, well, before we get into the weeds of how are we going to build the project, let's first of all properly define what it is we're building. So that what in formal project management terminology is known as scope definition. Mm-hmm. And scope definition is quantified through what we call deliverables. And in fact, Paul, on the screen here on the right-hand side, the turquoise highlighted rectangle is highlighting deliverables, and then there's quantities to the right of that. And why that's so important is, first of all, it quantifies our scope, but secondly, when benchmarking, it allows us to normalize the benchmark. So if we're looking at, for example, feed design, and our project says, okay, it's 168 days for our front-end engineering design work, and the benchmark comes back and says, well, that's a little on the shy side. Well, how do we know that that's correct? Because if the thing that we're comparing against had a different scope, in our project, we are working under the scope definition of 50 drawings. If the benchmark was based on a project that only had 25 drawings, that analogy and that comparison is fundamentally flawed. Well, if we know the quantities, which we do now because we're defining deliverables, we can automatically normalize the benchmark, taking into account the order of magnitude of the project that we're working on.
So it gives your project a little bit of context.
I think it's not just a little bit of context, it's mathematically adjusting the benchmark to give you a definitive, accurate benchmark and comparison.
Great.
And then work phasing. This is something that I am really excited about. So this has really nothing to do with durations, nothing to do with cost, nothing to do with sequence of work. What this is about is making sure that the time scale, the phase in which my work definition is being laid out is relevant and appropriate. So to give you a very simple example, Paul, we have procurement activities here in our example, starting on the 27th of November, going through the 19th of June, 2019. It's about five line items down.
Mm-hmm.
Well, my procurement duration of 205 days may be absolutely realistic. And my 400 and whatever it is there, $1,000 on the right-hand side, $4.2 million rather, again, could be a very, very good cost estimate. But I don't know whether that procurement scope is being carried out at the right phase of the project in order to sustain and support the subsequent construction scope. So being able to benchmark when different types of work should be carried out is really, really powerful. So productivity rates. So one of the challenges that some projects have run into, and we've had quite a bit of feedback on this, is, okay, well, we understand that artificial intelligence can help overcome this issue of descriptions and terminology not having to be the same. But if the historical scope of work in our previous projects isn't necessarily very close to the scope of work that we're building today, then this whole concept of benchmarking to help improve the plan, it becomes a true challenge because we don't have enough comparable information to do the benchmarking. Well, when you think about a project, if you boil down the project into a WBS and you boil the WBS into activities, you can actually boil activities down into another lower level element pool, and that is productivity rates and quantities. Because at the end of the day, it's the quantities with your productivity rates that actually drive the durations and the costs. And so by going to that next level down, you can actually benchmark based on productivity rates. And that's very, very useful for things like TAR or shutdown turnaround projects, where work is very, very heavily dependent on things like the number of crews and those, accurately forecasting those productivity rates.
Okay, great.
So there was a comment earlier about benchmark normalization. So again, one of the big challenges when gathering and capturing benchmarking data is those historical projects may have been impacted by unique events, or there may have been certain characteristics pertaining to that historical project that may not crop up again going forward, or may skew from the norm. Okay, so what we've done, we've come up with a very, very simple means of normalizing those historical projects. And we do it through what we call knowledge tags. So the way knowledge tags work, Paul, and there's an example of this on the right-hand side, a knowledge tag can represent one of those extenuating circumstances. So let's take complexity as a very simple, complexity as a simple example. So,
Okay.
so complexity here, we've got multiple values, and it's basically a sliding scale. And then what we're doing is we're applying those complexity factors to different areas of scope within our project. So what that means is in our historical benchmark, if, for example, the module scope here was less complex than normal, then when the computer makes that benchmark analysis, it needs to factor that historical benchmark to come up with a normalized version. Does that make sense?
It does. It kind of addresses the fact that, we like to say every project has a story, right? So it addresses the fact that every project may have been executed slightly differently, and it ensures that I have a normalized comparison point.
Yes, and again, this isn't just a single dimension. We mentioned the example of complexity. It could be things like weather. It could be, well, this particular project, we used a certain subcontractor that was 20% cheaper than what we've traditionally seen with regards to those subcontractors. The geographical location of one of our historical projects meant that site access took 20% longer than expected or was normal. So you can actually have, you called them sort of each project having a story. That story can be influenced and nudged by those multiple factors. And so we call those factors knowledge tags. Very, very easy to apply multiple tags to your benchmark data and then have the computer automatically normalize.
And organizations can have their own unique knowledge tags, or do we prescribe certain knowledge tags to them?
No, these absolutely are specific to each organization.
Great.
Now, having said that, without jumping the gun, let's talk later on towards the end of the webinar on the topic of what we call community benchmarking, because there are common stories and circumstances on projects that should be shared across multiple organizations.
Sure.
So just some pointers, I think, with regards to benchmarking. So probably an obvious one, but don't treat benchmarking as an absolute. If I have a duration of 100 days and my benchmark says, hey Dan, it normally takes 95 days, then don't look at my 100 days as a failure. I mean, that's a 5% delta. That's very, very good, in fact. So add a degree of reasonableness with regards to benchmarking, and that degree of reasonableness, Paul, the way we achieve that in Basis is through these little whisker markers. So on the right-hand side here, you see there's really a combination on this project of green whiskers and orange whiskers.
Mm-hmm.
So the green is telling me that I am within a given threshold for a reasonable duration. Okay.
Okay.
Orange is telling me that I have a breach. And again, a breach, it's sort of a bi-directional breach, because me getting my duration massively underestimated or underforecasted, I would suggest is just as bad as having a blowout and an overestimate.
Absolutely.
Yep. And again, I introduced this exciting topic of phase benchmarking, but I would suggest knowing when in the project my work should be executed is just as important as how long my work should take. And so the green and the orange backdrop shading here is exactly that. So if I have a green backdrop, Paul, it's telling me that in this case my permitting scope here is falling within the normal phase within which I would expect permitting to occur in order to support things like the floor and earthworks and concrete fabrication further down in the schedule.
Mm-hmm.
Conversely, though, when we get to contracting here and procurement, my duration is great because of the little green whiskers. So I've got the duration within my threshold. I'm good. However, I am actually going to execute my contracting scope here 24% in terms of the project lifecycle later than I should. I'm going to have a schedule bust because by the time I've executed my contracting, it's going to be too late for things like the subsequent delivery of modules.
So these benchmarks now, instead of it, again, going back to what we said at the beginning, right? Instead of this being a static reporting process, it's actually giving me guidance as I'm going through plan creation or critiquing.
It is, and you know, again, in the old days, you could argue, well, you go to your bookshelf and you pull out your printout of your historical project, and you could achieve this. This is real time. This is as you're building the plan, as the plan gets updated, as the plan is executed, as the plan is statused. It's real time, constant updating as to, do I have the durations correct? Is my cost estimate correct? Is the phasing right? Is the sequence of work realistic?
Great. So that engine is always on in the background every step that I take in the planning process.
It is, yes. Yep.
Great.
So in terms of reporting, another kind of useful aspect of this is being able to report against multiple benchmarks. So not just taking my project and saying, hey, I want to compare it to the last linear road construction project I worked on, but actually I want to look at perhaps a moving average of 3. So being able to assign multiple benchmarks and track and manage and build my plan to multiples makes the benchmarking process, it makes it stronger, and it's a stronger defense for me making changes to my plan.
So I don't have to go back and just look at one. I can go back and look at the last 4 vertical builds that I did.
Yes, well, you say 4, it's actually limited to 3, but yes.
Well, I mean, including the project that I'm currently planning.
Exactly, yes. Yep. So benchmark scoring, so being able to quantify the alignment or misalignment of benchmarking is really, really important. So we've introduced the concept of what we call the Realism Index. So it's a numerical 0 to 10 score as to how realistic is our project, or indeed, this can go down to the WBS or summary level activity. How realistic, again, with regards to duration and phasing, is our project relative to that benchmark? Now, you know, I think scoring mechanisms, yes, you know, telling me that I get a 7.7 out of 10, okay, that's interesting, but it's a little bit irrelevant. I think where it really drives positive behavior is for me to look at the score and go, well, now I want to go and pinpoint why that score is not a 10, and then that will naturally drive me towards fixing the elements that are pulling down that score. It's naturally driving me to improve my schedule.
Okay, so I can use the score at a project level to get a sense of how well aligned my project is with maybe my historical benchmarks, but I can drill down even further into the project itself and still see that score?
You can, in fact, a couple of slides back, you see the little thumbs up, thumbs down?
I do.
This is actually pinpointing for me the line items that are driving down that score.
Ah, very good.
Yep. So, all right, well, in the interest of time, I think we should probably do a little show and tell and walk through the product for a few minutes.
Excellent.
Okay, so let's jump over to our web browser. And Paul, I'm going to call on you a little bit in this demo, but I'm going to play the role of a project planner. And again, rather than using benchmarking for critiquing existing projects, I can see here the Realism Index. So previously, the projects that have already been built here have already been benchmarked. I'm going to take a different tact here and actually build a project from scratch and show how we can use the benchmarking to, again, to improve the realism of our schedule. Okay, so let's go ahead and just log in. Just go ahead and log into to Basis here.
Okay.
Okay. Marketing, you can edit out that little snafu during the recording. Okay, so let's go ahead and add our new project. It proves that this is a live demo, right?
That's right.
So we'll go ahead and create our project. We'll give it an estimated duration of, say, 5 years. Give it a estimated cost. We'll give it a little bit of context. So we'll explain to the computer the type of project we're building. And let's go ahead and start to build our project outline. So what I'm doing here is just I'm accelerating the build process, Paul, of building out my project. This really has nothing to do with benchmarking at this point. I'm just doing a semi-automated plan creation.
So it just makes it much faster to get to the starting point.
Yeah, I mean, I just built a CPM schedule here in a matter of seconds. It would have taken me hours in a traditional scheduling tool there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, again, talking of traditional scheduling tools, I would be in the Wild West at this point. I could start to move my activities around. I could start to detail out individual activities and sequence them, so on and so forth. But by doing that, I would have no idea whatsoever whether or not my plan is realistic or not, right? So as a precursor to this, a much smarter approach would be to say, okay, I'm going to go to the root level of the project, and for the project as a whole, I would like the computer to go off and use its intelligence, use its artificial intelligence engine to go and automatically benchmark my entire schedule. So I'm just about to hit benchmark here, Paul. What it's going to do, it's going to go off to the knowledge library. It's going to pick the historical benchmarks that are the closest match to the scope of work that I'm building.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to go ahead and assign those to my schedule. Okay.
So that would have taken hours, if not days, previously.
It would, absolutely. So, again, touching on just a couple of examples to tune you in here. If we go to the feed scope, again, my green rectangle is telling me that the feed scope is within the realms of normality with regards to when in the project. The green whiskers are telling me that I've got the duration correct. Okay.
Okay.
Now, conversely, I was just fiddling around with my procurement scope. I added a couple of activities which elongated the duration. Again, procurement here is starting during the right phase of the project or right period of the project. But because I sequenced those activities with what we call a finish to start relationship, I've now breached what is normal with regards to duration. In fact, my submittals and approval scope is actually now 50 days longer than we would typically see for procurement submittals and approval.
So again, while I'm starting at the right time frame, it's taking me longer than maybe my historical projects have indicated.
Yes. Yep. So as a fix, I could say, okay, well, I want to reduce the duration of my contracting scope and go ahead and factor that down. And now I'm within the normal realm, so I'm okay with regards to duration now. Okay, and I use the little accelerator there within the product to automatically factor it back. That's great. So my duration's good, my sequence is good, my phasing is good. Let's continue though building out our plan as we were mentioning earlier. So let's go back up to say our permitting scope here. Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to go ahead and add three activities within permitting. So again, regular CPM activities here. Yeah. Now, the little yellow indicator, Paul, we've talked about this in previous webinars, but this is a red flag. It's actually an orange triangle, but it's telling me that I need to tie off the logic. Mm-hmm. So by tying off the logic there, it's pushing out my sequence of work. Now, if I were to go ahead and update, for example, the duration of that preceding permitting scope, by doing that, look, the computer's now smart enough to say, okay, that's okay. You've increased permitting, but you've now pushed submittals and approvals out so far that it's out of phase now. You're going to have a problem when you get to construction.
Yep.
Make sense?
It does. It makes perfect sense.
And we're looking at duration, we're looking at phasing, we're looking at sequence. And again, if I were to bring back the duration of that permitting scope, okay, now the duration of permitting is good. My little whiskers turn green, but I'm still sequentially too late with regards to submittals and approvals for procurement.
So it's giving you real-time guidance as to the sequence and when it's supposed to occur, not just how long.
Exactly. Yep. And I'm getting a thumbs down here, look, on procurement because of that.
Because you've exceeded. Yep.
Yep. Okay. So what we're doing here is we're building our plan based upon the computer's suggestion as to what the standard benchmarks should be. And that's definitely very, very powerful, as we've seen. But let's take a step deeper into this. Let's go down to our construction scope. Now, rather than me just relying on the suggestion of the computer, what I can also do is say, well, I would like to interrogate my library of benchmarks because there may be multiple projects that I want to compare against, okay? So on the right-hand side here, Basis is providing me with those multiple suggestions. I think what's quite nice in this instance too is it's giving me a range look. It's saying, look, typically, Dan, this type of project, construction takes anywhere from roughly 600 days to 1,100 days. Okay, well, let's take a little closer look at that. So, you know, we talked about, or we've been building out our multi-level vertical build type project. And I've got two examples of a vertical build project here. So what I can do, Paul, is I can tell the computer, hey, I want to benchmark not against what the computer thinks is the most analogous project, but now I'm telling the computer, actually, I want to benchmark against a specific project, and in this case, two specific projects. Okay, so now if I just zoom out on the little scale here, I can see that typically for a vertical build project with this number of floors, the duration actually takes 335 days longer, and the phase at which the work is carried out typically starts a little bit later, 12% later. Now I'm okay with the 12% on the phasing, but I've under-egged my duration very, very significantly based on the scope of work, based on the number of floors. Make sense?
It does. It makes perfect sense. So how would I address this at this point?
So, yeah, so a couple of ways. You could manually walk through the scope of work, and you could increase the durations either arbitrarily by interacting with the Gantt chart, or you could do things such as you could change the quantity. So here, the number of floors, we could go ahead and adjust this accordingly. Okay. Or we could do factoring as well by using the slider. But in all three of those instances, what we're driving towards is, okay, we know we've massively underestimated our durations. Let's go ahead and adjust them and get back to that point of normality with the benchmark.
That's great. And we based it upon multiple previous projects, not just a singular data point.
In our example, we based it on two, yes. Yep. Now, everything I've talked about so far is really pertained to planning. Let's just very quickly go ahead and finish off building our plan. So what I'm going to do here is automatically populate that construction scope with activities. And for those of you that were on our previous webinar, we walked through how, again, we're pulling information from the knowledge library, pulling in those subnets, avoiding having to manually build that scope. I didn't really want to show you that for the sake of showing it. What I'm doing here, Paul, is I'm saying, okay, I've got to the point where my plan is now complete. And again, I'm going to go all the way up to the root level of my project, and I'm going to set a benchmark again, but instead of benchmarking now against what the computer thinks is the best analogous case, I'm actually going to do a self-benchmark, which means I want to take a snapshot of the project and benchmark against that. Now, let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so at this point, I've taken that that benchmark. I can see the benchmark values for each line item. The reason why this then becomes very valuable is, let's say we get into project execution, okay? And project execution for earthworks, for whatever reason, takes significantly more time, okay? So I'm just simulating or emulating delayed execution here. Now, when we go back to reporting and report this out, I can report this in Excel. And what this will do for me is give me a benchmark analysis, not just on, as we saw earlier, the computer suggestion for those durations, but now is actually comparing to my earlier plan as well. So for our early site work here, I can see the difference in what my plan was versus how I executed.
Okay, so you could do this at multiple points in time over the course of a project as well.
You can do it at multiple points in time, which gives you trending. And as you can see in the example here, I selected early site work. The computer's gone off and reported everything within site work, whether it's the parking lot, utility structure, entry access roads. I could have done exactly the same thing at any level within the project and run that analysis. So this will now not just report that construction scope, it will report, wow, look at that. That's showing me the entire project, benchmarking against historical plus my previous trend point across all of those WBSs. Pretty cool stuff, huh?
It's very cool stuff, and it certainly would take an extreme amount of time to do this in the traditional way.
Yep. And you haven't grilled me on cost, Paul, but everything I've walked through with regards to duration and sequence look also applies to cost. I can do cost benchmarking.
Great, so I can compare my cost as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep, which gets us towards triple constraint of cost, duration, and quality.
Great.
So that was our little walkthrough. So we're learning as we're going through this process, and I think we 12 months ago we hit the ground running. We had an incredibly useful concept. The artificial intelligence engine is so powerful. Today, though, we've got the AI engine to the point now where it actually self-learns. So to give you a bit of background there, Paul, when the computer was coming back with those benchmark suggestions, using multiple what we call attributes to try and understand context. So yes, of course, probably one of the first things it goes to look at is activity description. That's kind of a no-brainer, right? But again, what if the description doesn't match? I'm using design versus engineering. So it uses a series of attributes. So it starts to look at things like the parent. Do we have analogous deliverables? It looks at knowledge tags. It looks at duration, so on and so forth. Now, those attributes are weighted with regards to importance. And where the magic comes in with regards to machine learning now is, as I, the planner, as we saw in the demonstration, as I'm selecting those benchmarks, Basis is tracking why I selected them. Oh, it's because there was a really good match on description, or actually he's picking based on geographical location. And what it does, Paul, is it adjusts the weightings of those attributes automatically. So the product now is truly self-learning. The AI engine is experiencing machine learning. It's going to get more accurate as time goes on and the more that it's used.
That's great. And if for some reason I want to deviate from those learned weightings, is that something that I can do?
You can at your own peril, yes. So moving towards where are we headed? So again, a new concept. I'm describing it here as what we call community benchmarking. And you stole my thunder a bit earlier, Paul, asking about the concept of big data, right? And I alluded to the fact, yes, big data is valuable under the caveat that you have to have context. Without context, I don't think big data is very useful. So what we're doing is we are headed in the direction in 2019 where not only can an organization populate the benchmark library with its own organizational historical data, but as part of the product offering, InEight, our organization, will actually offer industry standards and historical durations, cost, productivity rates, so that you have these community benchmarks that you can also use rather than just your own historical projects. So we'll have the ability to not only look at how we're during the planning process leveraging the benchmarking to to help inform the planning process, but also go back and look at how
other similar projects done outside of the company?
Yes. Yep. And that's why we're calling it community benchmarking. So today, we've got the product to the point where we've absolutely got a very powerful AI or artificial intelligence contribution, the computer there making those benchmark suggestions. We also have what we call HI, which is human intelligence. And again, we walked through this on the previous webinar, where not only can the plan be influenced by those AI suggestions, but the plan can also be critiqued by team members giving their input. That's the HI. Now, if we add a third component to the mix in the form of CI or community intelligence, again, it's another layer of confidence that the suggestions and the benchmarking comparisons that are being made are as realistic and as analogous as they possibly can be.
That's an exciting development.
Yep. So it's I, hi, Kai. So let's wrap up. So I think we've shown immense value in benchmarking for new plan creation. We didn't touch too much on critiquing existing plans, but I think hopefully through the discussion and demonstration, you can see equal value in really applying the same techniques that we have for new plan creation. In my mind, it's all about driving plan realism and confidence. Yes, the AI stuff is helping. I think at the end of the day, it's making this process faster and more reliable. And again, the community stuff that we're working towards, I think, is just going to be another layer of validation driving towards that plan reliability.
And it's delivering true kind of project confidence at that point.
That's exactly right. And the whole concept of the days of risk analysis and risk workshops and uncertainty, I think it was a step in the right direction. We're turning all of that on its head, and we are leading and driving with project confidence, because again, you can make a plan, say whatever duration you want. You can make a cost estimate, say whatever dollar value. It doesn't matter. What matters is how confident are you that duration forecast and that financial forecast are correct and reliable. And that's what we're doing with the benchmarking.
That's extremely exciting.
So we also have an opportunity for others to ask questions at this point. If anybody wanted to type in anything for those of you participating live, into the chat or question window. I'm hoping they give us a couple simple questions on complexity. Or maybe orange whiskers.
So, Carolyn, there was a question on the concept of knowledge tags, and we didn't show that in the demonstration, but under the just on the concept of knowledge tags real quick. So let's take our construction scope and go to knowledge tags, and we are looking in this instance at, let's give this a location of, say, North America. Okay, so our construction scope, we've told the computer that we're executing the project in North America. If we go back to the suggestions, it's coming back with suggestions here. So the first suggestion here is 906 days. If we were to go ahead and change the location of our construction scope to, say, Australia, okay, those same suggestions now are being automatically factored based on the fact we're building in a different geographical location. So that was clarification on how those normalizers work. So that was the only incoming question that I saw.
Yep, and I just wanted to point out, I think the next time you're talking, you're talking on March 19th, is that right? Talking more about the team-based input gathering for planning, getting your whole project team involved?
Yeah, so that's the HI component, Carolyn, yes. Yep, and again, we're making some really incredible strides with regards to what I define as consensus-based planning. I think, even if I'm the most experienced planner in the organization, having my team members and stakeholders and discipline leads validate or even push back on my plan is, again, it's all driving plan realism. So yes, that's our third topic next month.
I think that'll be really interesting. So tomorrow there's a talk on choosing the right estimating solution through the eyes of and the experience of Kiewit, actually. So that'll be good. But I knew that yours was about the consensus-based planning. So we do have a question about the security protocols. If you could possibly give some examples of security protocols, particularly in government spaces.
Security pertaining to the product?
For the software, yes.
Okay, so so a fairly simple question and a potentially convoluted hierarchical answer. So there are different levels of security within the product. So at the application level, the product is hosted on Microsoft Azure. It's a multi-tenant application, so there are very, very strict firewalls. Each organization works in its own isolated sandbox. Within each of those sandboxes, then there is a hierarchy of access. So you have a knowledge administrator that can add users, participants, team members, so on and so forth. Those users can also be designated as a contributor or a creator. In the case of being a creator, those team members then can create projects. They can subscribe to the knowledge library. But again, there's a control mechanism in place such that if you want to publish information back to the knowledge library in the form of maybe updating the benchmark data, there is a review process by which the knowledge administrator has to review those updates before they get pushed back into the knowledge library. And we support things like single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, things like that.
So you talked about user roles. The person answering the question clarified a little and is asking whether you can even restrict possibly to community information for what's considered secure and potentially past project details.
Okay, so the concept of community information that I was alluding to, that is our next phase in the product. So today, the benchmarking pertains specifically to your own organization, but even within your own organization, you can limit who can create, who can view, who can edit that benchmarking data.
So it's all down to user permissions.
A lot of it is down to user permissions and the hierarchical nature of the product, yes.
Very good. There's another question on whether it's available, whether Basis is available online or also on-prem.
So Basis by design is a cloud-based SaaS solution.
Very good. And thank you very much. Those were great answers.
Well, you're very welcome. And I thoroughly enjoyed sharing my thoughts on benchmarking. And Paul, as always, thank you so much for your input and your wisdom.
Great, thank you guys very much. This was a great session.
Yep, that was good. Thank you all for spending the last hour with us, and I'm going to go ahead and end this talk. Thanks for joining us. 6 ways to improve the benchmarking of your project plan.